Lila Anderson's father, Dr. Ethan Anderson, raised her in the wilderness, was a well-known wildlife conservationist who dedicated his life to researching and defending large cats, especially tigers. Their residence wasn't conventional. Rather, it was a research sanctuary on the outskirts of a vast jungle where abandoned or, among the numerous creatures that came through the refuge, damaged animals were given another chance at life. The Bengal tiger cub Rhea, who was just 10 years old when her father brought Rhea home. The little cub was discovered scared and frail in the bush after losing her mother to poachers. A link was formed between LLA and Rhea the minute their eyes met, and LLA spent her days playing with Rhea and feeding the cub, and even sleeping next to her in a comfortable corner of the sanctuary. To her, Rhea was more than simply an animal. She was family, matured along with her untamed instincts, and by the time she was 2 years old, it was obvious. Dr. Anderson determined it was time for her to return to the wild after concluding that she was no longer fit for life at the sanctuary. On the day of Rhea's release, in a heartbreaking decision, LLA gave the. Rhea growled softly, whispering that the tiger would never forget you. Years went by, and it seemed as though she finally understood before vanishing into the jungle. Considering Riot, she had developed into a self-assured young lady who was pursuing a career in wildlife like her father. One day, Dr. Anderson, a biologist, declared his desire to return and see the jungle where Rhea had been liberated years before. Agala insisted on attending because she was anxious to reunite with the wild animal she loved. Rhea is a fierce tiger, as everyone warned her, and she won't remember you. Despite the fact that it's too risky, Lila's heart told her otherwise. Thought their relationship would still be intact. What transpired was a voyage into a meeting with the unknown in the depths of the jungle, a moment that would leave everyone stunned. Layla's heart pounded as the boat forced through the jungle's congested canals. The journey was more than a simple research expedition. It was Alongside her, Dr. Anderson reviewed the reunion she had always dreamed of, talking with the local guides about the tiger population changes since Rhea's disease using maps and notes. Unleash Lila's thoughts, but she was engrossed in the technical details. Through recollections of Rhea as a cub, her playful growls, the way she nuzzled Layla, and the mutual trust they had established, Rhea has been briefed by seasoned trackers with decades of expertise. Over the years, she has been seen in this area. One of them pointed to a location on the map, but you should. Since wild tigers can be unpredictable, we should maintain a safe distance if we come across one. LLA nodded, but the warning just strengthened her resolve. She was unable to articulate why, but she had a feeling Rhea would. In a private time on the boat, she told her father, "I know it's risky, but I need to try Rhea." Dr. Anderson put a hand on her shoulder and said, "I know how you feel, but keep in mind that tigers are solitary by nature, and she has made this her home. Doesn't include us anymore." The appearance of claw marks cut off their talk. The guides confirmed that deep grooves on a nearby tree suggested the presence of a dominating female tiger. The gang prepared to go through the thick forest on foot after anchoring the boat in what was known as Rhea's area. They were surrounded by the clamor of the jungle, with birds calling, leaves rustling, and distant roars resonating through the trees. LLA was both excited and nervous. Every noise made her question whether, after hours without seeing the tiger, the group stopped close to Dr. Anderson took advantage of the brief respite to explain to LLA how tigers. He indicated with a claw tree paw to mark their territory and explained how to read their presence as indicators. Footprints in the ground and the subtle, musky scent of a tiger close by as they were getting ready to. The air expanded as one of the guides lifted his hand to signal silence, and everyone froze. Silent, with only the gentle crunch of leaves beneath the feet and a deep growl coming from the shadows. Echoed across the area, the snarl intensified, and the group automatically retreated from Layla's. As the tiger entered the clearing, her heart raced, and she could sense the tension in the air. Her coat was a brilliant orange, having deep black stripes and eyes that glowed with a predator's untamed intelligence. Riala muttered that she was unable to control herself. The tiger's ears briefly perked up at her words. The enormous feline remained motionless, staring at Lila as the guides murmured. Despite being told to stay back, LLA took a tentative step forward, and her father seized her arm. "Don't you know me, Dad?" she whispered, her voice faltering, and she bent down gently to make. She tilted her head to make herself appear less menacing. Raya, face that was almost inquisitive, and then, to everyone's surprise, she took a step. The guides tightened their grips on their tranquilizer guns, prepared to step in, when Dr. Anderson gave the order for. Rhea gave Layla a gentle rumble to get them to hold off, not a predator's menacing growl, but one that LLA recognized as being the same rumble Rhea had created as a youngster. And when she was joyful, Lila's eyes filled with tears as the tiger approached, smelling the air around her. "I told you to remember what LLA said," she murmured, her voice breaking. Rhea bowed her enormous head, and, for a minute, their foreheads with emotion touched. It was such a tender and familiar gesture that the years vanished, and Lila's heart grew with happiness. Seemed to be a girl and her tiger back in the sanctuary. But the moment was abruptly cut short. Rhea was startled by stirring in the bushes and retreated, following her instincts. Leia realized that this was Rhea's world now, and that she was merely a. The visitor experienced a bittersweet mixture of emotions as the tiger vanished into the woods. Though the relationship between her and Rhea remained strong, the experience made her realize that Rhea was no longer she was a queen of the jungle, now flourishing in her natural habitat, having raised a cub. "Habitat, you received your response, LLA." Dr. Anderson put a reassuring arm around his daughter, but she didn't. I didn't remember that she smiled through her tears, and that's all I needed to know. That when the group returned to the boat, the jungle came alive with the sounds of their amazing. Nevertheless, the trip had been worthwhile for LLA, and Rhea was more than just. The boat voyage back to that recollection would always be a part of her. Symphony, LLA rested on the railing while the base camp was silent, the sound of the engine mingling with the bush. As her mind wandered back to her meeting with Rhea, she repeatedly relived the scene and the contact of their foreheads and the unbreakable bond that persisted after all those things happened over the gentle rumble. Years, Dr. Anderson, who was seated close by, shattered the quiet that was remarkable. Even if they had recognized someone from their past, the majority of wild animals wouldn't have reacted in that manner. Replied in a voice full of astonishment that she still seemed to trust me, yet I could. Her father stated that she had transformed, as seen by the wildness in her eyes. You provided Rhea the opportunity, and in the meantime, the guides are where she should be, or more reserved, even though they had seen a unique instance of human-animal interaction. Well conscious of the dangers, one mentor, a seasoned tracker named Teo, went up to Dr. Anderson, saying, "We should proceed with caution, sir. Even though Rhea demonstrated trust today, we must remember that Dr. Anderson is still a wild tiger." Nodded, promised to follow the plan, keep an eye on it from a distance, and stay away from fearing dangers. The party assembled around a map at the base camp to organize their next. Maddo's steps indicated a location higher up the river where Rhea's movements had been traced. He added in a cautious tone that she might have cubs recently, which is not unusual for a tigress her age, in which case we must exercise considerably greater caution. Leia's interest in cubs was rekindled by the prospect of Rhea getting them. Incredible, indicating that she is not only surviving, but flourishing. Yes, Maddo. But a mother tiger is extremely protective if we approach her too closely, she said, hesitant to stand up for them in spite of the warning. Leia's enthusiasm fueled the concept. It was touching to see Rhea start a family of her own, demonstrating that their attempts to help her get well and get out of having been successful. The team got ready for another expedition into as they loaded the jungle. They would venture more into Rhea's domain this time. Layla was given a set of binoculars by Boat Maddo. "You'll need these." The boat voyage was longer this time, so if we're lucky, we might see her from a safe distance. As the river meandered through thick jungle canopy that appeared to enclose them, the air was heavy with her. She studied the seashore as the dampness and the sounds of exotic birds reverberated through the trees. Binoculars, her pulse pounding in expectation. The boat abruptly slowed. Maddo held up his hand to indicate hushed tracks, and he muttered, pointing to the The squad cautiously disembarked from the muddy bank, following the new paw prints that led into the bush. The evidence grew more noticeable as they moved into the thick undergrowth. Clawed trees, splintered branches, and the guides moved precisely, their eyes searching every dark, and there was a slight tiger musk fragrance. Remained near her father, her joy subdued by the gravity of the situation, and then they heard a low growl. The group froze in a distant but distinct manner, and Matto signaled for everyone to remain low and quietly. He looked forward with his binoculars. A moment later, motioned for LLA to peer through the thick greenery, where she could see Rhea relaxing. Two young cubs were playing with her in the shade of a big tree. As they investigated their surroundings, their small bodies awkwardly tripped over one another. The sight of the surrounds made Lila's breath catch in her throat. She would never. She is a mother, doctor, she said in a voice full of wonder. I forgot she has cubs. With pride in his eyes, Anderson grinned and said, she did well. The squad stayed at, passively observing Rhea's interactions with her cubs from a safe distance. The tigress was at ease. The cubs are not immediately concerned despite the cautious eyes sweeping the area. As the humans' fun antics persisted, LLA couldn't help but feel a feeling of accomplishment after years of care and the challenging choice to release Rhea into the wild had brought Rhea to this point when she was not only surviving but flourishing. The group decided it was time to return to the bush as the sun started to drop. Before leaving, LLA took a final glance and saw that there was nowhere to stay after nightfall. Knowing that this would probably be her last time, she muttered a silent goodbye to her cubs. Opportunity to see them on the return boat voyage. The team's attitude was reflected in amazement of what they had seen, but they were also aware of the difficulties Rhea was facing. Matto's voice broke the quiet. A tigress with the cubs will draw interest from competing tigers and other predators. We must protect her from poachers as well. Dr. Anderson nodded and reported our findings to the sanctuary so that patrols in the region can be increased. LLA gazed out at the river, thinking that seeing Rhea again had fulfilled all of her dreams. However, it also came with a sense of duty because Ray's existence in the wild was precarious and Ela was forced to. Concerned about her future, LLA looked to her father as the boat anchored to the base camp. Do you believe we won't see her again? Dr. Anderson put a comforting touch on her. Perhaps on her shoulder, but even if we don't, we know she belongs there. Lila grinned broadly. Despite the sad farewell, Rhea was more than just a memory. She was now a living example of the strength of love, trust, and the wild's tenacity. The group convened early the following morning to talk about their remarks. Although Mateo stayed, Rhea's cubs had given everyone hope. He warned them that there were cubs present and that we must tread carefully. Rhea will become more defensive as everything changes, and we don't want to unintentionally place her or the cubs in danger as they prepared their gear. But they couldn't get rid of the impression that something wasn't quite right. Every moment felt like the calm before a storm, since breathtaking had an unpredictable quality. Storm, but the opportunity to find out more about Rhea and her cubs was worth it. As they followed the path they had indicated the day before, the gang ventured into the thick greenery. This time there, every rustle in the brush, every far-off bird's call, the movements were more deliberate and slower, intensified their perceptions that the bush was alive and that they were only guests as they got closer. Rhea Matto signaled everyone to stop by holding up his hand in the place where they had last seen him. He looked around the ground and he pointed to a new set of tracks, saying, she's been here recently, and she's traveling swiftly. Why would she be doing so quickly? LLA inquired. Mateo scowled as she spoke, maybe indicating that she perceived the danger. Lila's heart pounded as the teen pressed on their pace, conjuring. What if Rhea had been discovered by poachers? What if a competitor tiger had been discovered? She clenched her fists, resolved to help her cubs if they discovered her in distress. And then there was a guttural roar. Everyone was frozen in place as the sound of Rhea's voice reverberated through the trees. Mateo led the group toward the sound while indicating silence and distress. His movement was quick, but as they drew closer, cautious trailed closely behind, her heart thumping in her ears. When they got closer, they noticed Rhea pacing next to a group of shrubs, Her ears were flattened, and her tail whipped in rage. The cubs were nowhere to be seen, and something was amiss. Maddow nodded, her voice barely audible as she said, "She's upset. We need to figure." Dr. Anderson gestured for LLA to find out what's happening without further frightening her. Remain behind while he and Maddow approached, scanning the area with binoculars. Area surrounding Rhea and Maddow noticed a big snake curled up next to a hollow wood. The enormous snake, whose scales gleamed in the filtered light, was hidden where the cubs were. The cubs were seriously threatened by sunlight, and Ryan understood that we needed to take action. Maddow shook his head as LLA said, "It's too risky for us to step forward. Cannot immediately step in. Rhea must deal with this alone, but what if she?" Dr. Anderson put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Can I?" as her voice broke. "This is her environment, so we must follow her instincts." Ray's growls became more intense. The snake sensed her approach and uncoiled slightly in a warning challenge combination. As predator faced predator, each measuring up, the tension was evident as its head was elevated in a menacing posture. Then Rhea suddenly sprang forward, lunging at the snake. The two creatures slammed toward one another in a flash, their hisses and howls. The crew stared in startled silence as Rhea pondered with such passion that it left no room for doubt. Doubted her resolve to defend her cubs because the battle was fierce and the snake, hitting repeatedly as Rhea subdued it with her strong jaws and enormous paws after what seemed like a lifetime, gave the snake a final, devastating punch that pinned it to the ground, and she released a breath she hadn't realized she'd taken was released by a victorious roar, her power over the intruder proven. With a voice full of wonder, she whispered, "I did it," and Maddow nodded. As a true fighter, Rhea focused on the hollow log and cautiously sniffed it. Before gently pushing it with her nose, the cubs appeared a little while after. Their small bodies shook, but Rhea licked them all without hurting them, her growls becoming reassuring. The squad silently observed the union, their emotions bursting with respect for the tigress. It was an instance of unbridled beauty, the love and tenacity of a mother. Exposed as the group started to disperse, allowing Rhea and her cubs the room they needed, and she couldn't help but feel a stronger bond with the tigress. "She's amazing," she said quietly. "She seems to know exactly what she must do, regardless of the risks." Dr. Anderson grinned. "And it's harsh for you, but it's also lovely back at the base camp where the team." After considering what they had seen, Maddow, who was always quiet, spoke up. "This alters the situation. Therefore we must keep a closer eye on Rhea's domain. Cannot allow anything to happen to her or the cubs." Dr. Anderson concurred. "Rhea has demonstrated her ability to manage herself, but the refuge needs more guards. Sitting by the campfire, the more we can do to preserve her ecosystem, the better." Looked into the flames, feeling both humbled and excited by the strength and resiliency of the day's events. Were evidence of the wild's strength and grace, but they also brought attention to her vulnerability. "Existence, I wish I could remain here forever," exclaimed her voice just a little bit higher than A. Dr. Anderson chuckled in a whisper. "Remember that the jungle has a way of drawing you in. We work here to make sure it survives even when we're not there. So, it has a sense of direction." She had arrived to see Rhea, but she was taking with her a renewed dedication to safeguarding. As the team continued to watch Rhea and her cubs from a distance, Layla observed the wild and the creatures that called it home. Found herself thinking back on her early years spent with the Tijis. Their relationship was. She never imagined having to go through this again, but here she was. That night back at Camp LLA, seeing the tiger she had reared flourish in the wild in the middle of the jungle. She sat outside her tent, unable to sleep, and stared at the moonlight coming through the canopy. Her thoughts were, she was so overcome by what she had witnessed earlier that the thought of Rhea defending her cubs sparked something deep inside of her. Maddow's intense sense of pride and longing after realizing Lila's absence. He asked, "Can't sleep?" as he joined her by the campfire from the tents. "A cup of tea," and she shook her head. "Seeing Rhea today reminded me of. I never imagined seeing her again, much less this stunningly." Mateo concurred, "But keep in mind that she's not the same tiger you know years ago." Lila agreed, but she was unable to change them because she is made for survival. Help wondering if Rhea still recognized her. Their relationship was based on trust and more than just survival. Could love last years of being apart? The following morning, as the squad got ready to follow Rhea once more, LLA experienced a tense sense of exhilaration. She was unsure of the day would bring, but she was resolved to savor every second as the group went back to the earlier day, discreetly making their way through the thick jungle while keeping their senses sharp. Shortly after they heard the wild sounds, they noticed Rhea relaxing beneath a big tree where her cubs were tumbling over each other in a joyful manner, and Maddo said, "Stay back," wished to frighten her, but as Alele's heart began to race, she desired Rhea to observe her and be aware that she was present. Disregarding Mateo's warning, Alele stepped. Mateo snarled as she moved forward slowly, deliberately, and without danger. The tigress raised her head at Amber, but she didn't. All of her attention was on Rhea. The tension was instantaneous as Ray's eyes locked onto Ella. Her ears pricked up, and she, body tensed, and the cubs, noticing their mother's shift in attitude, froze in. Location: Layla halted at a safe distance, her heart racing in her chest. Rhea. For a brief minute, it seemed as though time had stopped as she spoke gently and trembled. "It's me." Even so, the surrounding jungle appeared to disappear, leaving only Rhea and LLA. The tigress rose gently to her feet during their shared moment, her eyes never leaving. As the squad waited to see, Lila stared in startled silence, holding their breath. What would happen next? Rhea stepped forward cautiously, her motion smooth and deliberately. LLA showed no signs of violence by keeping her hands by her sides. "Or fear. Don't worry, I'm here," she said. The tigress drew nearer to her nose. Something in her eyes sparked as she caught a whiff of Lila's smell. Curiosity and recognition. LLA was unaware, yet hope at last filled her heart. Rhea paused a short distance away, lowering her head a little and revealing her amber eyes. Looking into Lila's face, she grinned as her eyes began to flood up with tears. Her voice was hardly heard as she continued, "You remember me, don't you?" Rhea's attention was diverted by a playful growl from one of the cubs. As she checked on her young, her maternal instincts took over, but she also, to everyone's surprise, she turned back to look at LLA, and the tigress moved closer to her. A huge figure loomed over the young lady, and she cautiously held out her palm, up, demonstrating to Rhea that she didn't mean any harm, and to her surprise, Rhea softly pushed her hand. The little contact with her nose was enough to cause tears to fall. Maddo and the rest of the squad stared in amazement as Lila's face. "I've never seen anything like it," he muttered. Dr. Anderson nodded his wonder's look as a testimonial to their bond. It's uncommon but genuine that Rhea turned her back. She went back to her cubs, giving them a gentle nuzzle as though to reassure them, moved aside to give the tigress the room she required. She wiped away her tears and turned to face Maddo, who nodded slightly. With approval, Lila experienced a feeling of calm as they returned to camp. Had not seen Rhea in years, but their brief encounter had fulfilled all of her expectations and more. Back at camp, the team talked about it as evidence that their relationship had not been weakened by time or distance. Dr. Anderson stated that what they had seen altered everything. Reaction to LLA is a unique opportunity to see how deeply these creatures feel, hence it's important too. Maddo agreed that more research is necessary, but we must exercise caution while interacting with people. The more we risk interfering with their normal habits, the more they recognize their concern. However, for the time being, she let herself enjoy the happiness of the day's events by meeting Rio once again and knowing that was flourishing. The euphoria of Leia's reunion gave her a fresh sense of purpose. Was brief because during the teens' debriefing around a campfire that night, Maddo expressed a worry that lingered. He started off by saying, heavy in the air, in a cautious yet forceful tone, "What happened today was amazing, but it's also dangerous because Rhea might remember you. But she's crazy. Animal. We are unable to foresee how she will respond the following time." The words, "I understand, Maddo," were opposed by my heart, yet seeing her again felt like. She looked at Dr. Anderson and recalled me, as if we were still connected. Whoever made that link is amazing. Yet its flimsy, wild instincts went out. We must proceed cautiously over previous ties for a benefit as much as. The topic of discussion shifted to the applications of their research findings. Cubs had to adjust to the difficulties of the jungle, and the group couldn't risk interfering with their. Mado's upbringing placed a strong emphasis on keeping a safe distance while watching instead of interacting. The team headed out the following morning with a fresh sense of caution, monitoring Ree's moves, using binoculars to view her and the cubs from a distance, while cautiously hiding behind thick foliage. Distance the tigress seems to have gone back to her regular activities of teaching her cubs survival skills and hunting for food. Abilities, but as they observed a fresh obstacle, a bigger tiger appeared. When more hostile entered Ree's domain, the group anxiously observed as the intruder approached her den. Dr. Anderson clarified in a quiet voice that male tigers can be territorial and harmful to cubs. Voice, that might be a problem. Rand saw the intruder and proceeded right away. She positioned herself between the male and herself and snarled low and deep while on high alert. As the two tigers assessed each other's muscular capabilities, cubs, the tension was evident. Layla's pulse pounded as she watched the situation she wished to happen, coiled and ready to attack. She wanted to step in immediately, but she knew that doing so would only endanger everyone. All she could do was pray that Ree's instincts and power would be sufficient to keep her cubs safe during the standoff, which seemed to. The male tiger growled and lunged for a very long time, but Rhea was swift and the cubs crowded together as Mom fiercely retaliated against his attack with a sweep of her enormous paw, sending him reeling back. Their tiny bodies shook as they witnessed their mother battle for the first time, following several vicious altercations between the male. Rhea retreated, defeated, and stood triumphant, her chest heaving as she gave a final warning roar. Back at camp, the cubs approached her carefully and nuzzled her legs to reassure her. Examined the video they had taken, and Mado declared his admiration for Ray was clear. Her tenacity is amazing. Not only is she thriving, but she was unable to get rid of the fear she had experienced. What if the man returns during the altercation? Or is there another predator? For the cubs in particular, the forest is quite perilous. Dr. Anderson put a comforting hand on her shoulder. Rhea has demonstrated her ability to manage herself while instructing. As the days went by, the team naturally developed the abilities her cubs would need to survive. Kept watching Rhea, recording her conversations with the cubs and the difficulties they encountered, and Lila's desire to. She appreciated the tiger's determination to maintain their distance, but her desire to bond with them grew greater. After a storm swept through one evening, soaking the bush with rain, the group took refuge in their tents. But Rhea's concern kept distracting LLA from her sleep. And if the cubs had been unable to find shelter from the storm, were they safe? Shake her uneasiness. So she picked up a lamp and went outside after sensing a strong draw. Uncontrollable need to locate Rhea, disregarding reason, and following the slender remnants of the tigress. Trekking through the rain-soaked jungle was dangerous due to the storm's muddy trails and low visibility. Layla tripped and slipped, but she persisted out of dread and perseverance. She eventually noticed a recognizable silhouette in the distance. Was Rhea hiding her cubs beneath a big tree to protect them from the flood? She was struck with awe by Rhea's strength as she observed the tigers huddled protectively around her. In perseverance, the tigress had endured a great deal, but she never wavered in her position as a mother. But as she remained there observing from the shadows, a spooky sound, a deep, low growl, came to her ears. She carefully rotated her flashlight, catching the gleam of eyes in the dark, frightening. Lila paused, her mind racing as she noticed that another predator was close by, lured by the cub's scent. Although she was aware that she couldn't outrun the predator and lead it to Rhea and the cubs, she mustered the bravery to try to look bigger and more menacing by waving her flashlight. "Go away," she yelled. With a trembling yet powerful voice, the jaguar predator growled and stepped. Lila's pulse was racing as she prepared for what appeared to be inevitable, when suddenly when the tigress emerged, she roared loudly, her presence commanding and fearful. The jaguar faltered, its self-assurance faltering under Rhea's intense gaze. It snarled one last time before slinking back into the bush. It let out a shaky exhale. Rhea walked up to her, her amber eyes briefly meeting Lila's as her knees almost buckled under her. It was a tacit agreement between them, a mutual acknowledgement of the connection they still had, and then with her gentle prodding. When Rhea's enormous head led LLA back to safety, the storm passed. Returned to camp under Rhea's watchful eye after emerging from the Dr. Anderson and Maddo hurried to meet Lila, who was shaking and drenched in the jungle. Maddo said in a sharp, worried tone, "Were you thinking?" "I couldn't sleep. I needed to know Rhea and her." And LLA acknowledged that her voice was no more than a whisper. Dr. Anderson looked from Lila to the tigress, but the cubs were safe. "You stepped outside during the storm and saw Rhea, who inquired incredulously as you lingered at the edge of the clearing." Mixing with interest, Leia said, "Yes," in a calmer voice, "and she saved me. A jaguar, and she kept me safe." The squad gaped in disbelief, and Maddo shook his into amazement that the tiger continues to defy everything we believe that we are aware of wild animals. Rhea stayed a little while longer before withdrawing into the jungle with her cubs. As she watched her leave, a mixture of thankfulness and longing grew within of her chest. "She recalled me, and I'm positive of it," Maddo sighed. "This bond of yours is amazing, LLA, but it's risky for you both because Rhea is crazy." Lala nodded, but the expression in her eyes said that every interaction has the potential to break the delicate equilibrium we are trying to watch. I stated that she wasn't prepared to part with the bond that she had rekindled over the course of the following few days. Team concentrated on their study, but there was an unsaid conflict between Mateo and Dr. Anderson. As LLA struggled with mixed emotions, she was cautious about future interactions with Rhea in respect to the team's scientific mission, but one evening as the crew was reviewing, she elevated her heart for the tigress. Dr. Anderson saw something strange in the video of Rhea and her cubs, and he pointed to. Rhea continues to guide her cubs toward the river on the screen, but she avoids anything Mateo is doing by not crossing. His brow was wrinkled. Could it be Dr. Anderson or another predator? Responded or a human presence? We must look into it the following morning. Followed Rhea's path to the riverbed, where they discovered trash that had been discarded and indications of human activity. "This isn't good," Maddo remarked sadly, referring to the homemade bonfire and deep tire tracks that led into the woods. Rhea is avoiding the water because she thinks that the poacher's heart is sinking. Danger. Her intuition is keeping her cubs safe. Dr. Anderson nodded. "So we must inform the local authorities about this and make sure the area is watched over, as they have recorded the proof that when she considered losing Rhea and her family to poachers, she became extremely protective of them. It was intolerable that night, and she lay awake with her mind racing, unable to get rid of the picture of Rhea separating her from the jaguar. Her fierce devotion, as clear as it had been as a cub, LLA, felt compelled to return their loyalty. So the following morning, she went to Maddo and Dr. Anderson with a suggestion. "We must do more than just disclose this. We must figure out how to safeguard." Leia was a researcher, and Maddo scowled at Rhea and her cubs. "Our responsibility as wildlife rangers is to observe and record, but this isn't merely about the research." LLA emphasized that I raised Rhea, and she isn't simply another tiger to me. "I understand how you feel, Dr. Anderson, and I owe her my assistance. However, entering here could endanger us all because poachers are vicious." Leia's unwavering in my resolve. "I'll take the chance that Rhea will do the same for me." The team decided to change their plans in spite of their misgivings. They would install more cameras in motion in order to keep an eye on poaching activity and report their findings to the local authorities. The sensors around the river plunged themselves into the. As they worked together, Layla's determination and affinity with Rhea were too strong for her to assist. But consider the decision she had made. She had always understood that letting Rhea go. It was the proper decision to release Rhea into the wild, but it hadn't been simple to see her flourish as a mother. Notwithstanding the difficulties in the jungle, LLA felt a strong sense of pride, yet wasn't sufficient to allay her worries. What if Rhea and her cubs were discovered by poachers before the authorities could? One afternoon, while they watched the video, the notion of intervening drove her to exert more effort. From their recently installed cameras, LLA saw a group of men brandishing firearms that made her heart race. Was traveling swiftly over the river toward Rhea's land, Maddow remarked. Dr. Anderson's voice was tight with desperation. We must alert the authorities. He snatched the transmitting the information via radio to the nearby Wildlife Protection Unit. But Lila knew the jungle too well to think that aid would come in time, so she couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I'm going after them, remarked in a steady voice, but Maddow firmly took hold of her arm and added, No. She met his gaze and said, I have to, it's too risky. If we wait, it might be. It was too late for Rhea and her cubs, and she hurried through the jungle, her heart racing, followed the poacher's trail, even though she knew it would be extremely risky. But the idea of Rhea and her cubs provided her the strength to keep going because she was in danger. As she got closer, she heard voices. She squatted low, looking through the leaves at the poachers, impatient and grumpy. Lila's mind was racing. She needed a plan. They were laying a trap next to a clearing where Rhea frequently rested with her cubs. Her eyes landed on a nearby object to alert Rhea without exposing herself to the poachers. An idea started to shape as the tree's branches arched over the clearing. With each cautious step, her pulse pounding, she ascended the tree as silently as possible. The sounds of the poachers were just below her, and their laughter made her nervous, so she stood on a robust branch that is close enough to act below the surface, yet high enough to stay unseen. Poachers started distributing bait that was obviously meant for Rhea and her, loaded with traps. Cubs Layla was furious, but she forced it to go since there wasn't time for her. With hesitation, she produced a whistle, a memento from her early training sessions with. Rhea hoped the noise would warn the tiger of danger without warning the. Taking a deep breath, the poachers mimicked by blowing the whistle in short bursts. As they searched the area, the poachers' heads snapped up in response to the alarm calls of the jungle birds. Woods, one of them swore, what was that? Probably no one else answered. His voice conveyed uneasiness as he continued to blow the whistle in different patterns. Although she was aware that Rhea's keen intuition would detect the warning, she appeared to become increasingly upset. Let's get this one done quickly, he said, pointing to the traps where Rhea was sleeping in the distance. Her ears perked as she heard the whistle with her cubs, a familiar rhythm that evoked long-forgotten memories. Recollection, she stood up, her strong body alert, and her cubs followed. Her lead, Ryan, moved quickly after sensing their mother's discomfort, carefully guiding her cubs away from the whistle's direction because she was aware of its sound, but also because it signaled danger. She moved through the thick underbrush, using survival instincts she had developed over years of being in the wild. Lila's arm started to hurt from maintaining her position back in the tree, but she refused to. The poacher's radio abruptly came to life with a voice on the other end. In yelled commands telling them to move upriver so they wouldn't be noticed by wildlife. One poacher snarled and kicked the bait trap in, and Ranger's fare came upon us. As the men gathered their gear and withdrew, LLA held her breath in frustration. Before descending from the tree, she waited until their voices had faded into the distance. Her legs felt unsteady, but she was relieved. Ran through her as she realized her strategy had succeeded, and she went back to where she had been, being cautious not to create any noise. Her heart grew when she arrived at the location where Rhea and her cubs had been sleeping. Relief that the tiger and her young had left their trail, which led farther into the jungle, where they were temporarily secure. When they got back to the camp, Layla saw Mateo and Dr. What were you thinking, Anderson? While he waited impatiently for her, Mateo demanded, his voice that was angry and worried at the same time. You might have been caught, or worse, I couldn't just do nothing. Rhea and her cubs were in traps set by poachers, she replied in a strong tone. Dr. Anderson touched Mateo's shoulder in peril, and his face softened. She took a calculated chance, and it paid off. However, you must comprehend how. This was risky for both you and Rhea. If those men had discovered you, it might have gotten worse. And Elowen nodded her defiance before giving in. I understand that I'm exhausted, but if something were to happen to Rhea, I couldn't bear it. The following day, the team received confirmation that I was too scared to act. Although it was a minor win, the local authorities had stopped the poachers and seized their equipment. Knew the fight was far from finished. The jungle was huge, and poachers were relentless. Dedicated to staying ahead of the game, LLA suggested a new strategy that requires more work. During a team meeting, she stated that we must establish a secure environment before monitoring and reporting. Matto cocked an eyebrow and explained how Rhea and her cub's safe sanctuary is a location too dangerous for poachers to approach. Do you suggest that we use their own anxieties against them? Yes, said LLA. If they believe this location is a threat, we can put up decoy traps with hidden cameras to record their movements. Dr. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. Under constant surveillance, they'll be less likely to return. Although it's a daring plan, it might just succeed. We need to cooperate with the local rangers and deploy drones to increase our. Then, the group built fake traps and got to work, motivated by a common goal. Each one in Rhea's domain is equipped with motion-activated cameras and transmitters, and they also erect covert speakers that might produce human activity noises, giving the impression that the region is being closely watched as the days. Rhea and her cubs appear to return to their natural rhythm as they pass the bush, continued to flourish while their motions were recorded by the team's cameras. They viewed the video with a mix of, with pride and longing. She was astounded by Rhea's growth, not only in stature but also in, with assurance. The formerly imprisoned tiger became a queen of the jungle, gracefully leading her cubs and power. But the idea that poachers wouldn't give up tempered Lila's relief. The struggle to keep Rhea and herself safe made her heart skip a beat whenever she spotted a fresh set of tracks close to the river. One evening, while the team was reviewing their most recent film, they discovered that the family was far away. Rhea's cubs splashing in the shallow water as she stood at the river's side was a beautiful moment. She was seen by the camera, raising her head and staring directly into the lens, knowing that we were observing her. Matto laughed, a smile gently pulling at her lips, and she doesn't seem to keep in mind that she has faith in you. Dr. Anderson acknowledged that trust is powerful and uncommon. It serves as a reminder of what we're fighting for, the relationship that Rhea and Lila have built, having been tempered by the difficulties of the outdoors and preserved in the purity of childhood. It was evidence of the timeless bond between people and the natural world, which is worth every danger and over the coming weeks, Rhea and her cubs adjusted to their protected region. The cubs' fun, wrestling, grooming moments were captured on tape. Every footage of the family lounging beneath the towering tree's shade and the mother's love provided tremendous pleasure to the group, but for LLA, it was a very intimate glimpse into the tiger's life. Yet one day, when looking over the video, LLA saw something strange. Rhea was limping. The elegant tiger made an uncomfortable gait movement, and her left paw hardly touched the ground. Her face was filled with worry. Dr. Anderson and Mateo were immediately informed by LLA that we needed to check on her, said that she might not be able to hunt and take care of her cubs if she is hurt. Matto scowled. You know the risks. She's crazy now, so we can't just approach her and have a look. Dr. Anderson, her paw, is always the voice of reason. Use the tranquilizer wisely. Gun if required, but only as a last resort. Let's take a cautious approach and evaluate the scenario first. The group left at first light, equipped with their tools and led by. The trip was difficult given the GPS tracker Layla had put on Rhea after their first reunion. Despite the difficulties, their stamina is put to the test by the thick forest and uneven terrain. Unwavering determination. Rhea needed her, and she wasn't going to disappoint her ass. As they got closer to Rhea's location, they reduced their speed and moved more stealthily to prevent shocking the. When Tiger LLA first saw her, Rhea was clearly limping as she shifted next to a fallen log with her cubs. With a little wince, she muttered that she was hurt but not incapacitated. Let's watch her for a bit before making a decision. Dr. Anderson nodded and prepared a tranquilizer gun in case Matto continued to. Hours went by while the team kept an eye on Rhea and the surrounding region to make sure they were safe. Unaware of their mother's distress, the cubs played close by while Rhea observed them with a tired but protecting stare. her fortitude unwavering in spite of her wounds. Lila's heart aching as she muttered, "We can't leave her like this. She's in pain, but she's doing her best." It appears that she may have stepped on something sharp, so Dror Anderson adjusted his binoculars. "If we can." Maddow shook his head and said, "Come closer. We might be able to help without using the tranquilizer." "What happens if she attacks?" "We're still discussing a mature tiger, Lila's." Mateo opened his mouth to say. Determination hardened. "She wants, she knows me." Dispute. But he reluctantly stopped when he noticed Layla's conviction. He nodded, but proceeded with caution as LLA cautiously walked toward Rhea, her heart racing. She spoke gently while keeping her hands visible on her chest and moving deliberately. "Tell the tiger, hey girl, I'm here to help." Rhea's golden eyes and ears pricked up as she briefly stared at LLA in the jungle. Sensing the stress, the tiger's cubs scrambled behind her, seemingly holding their breath, but believing their mother's judgment. She bent down and held out her hand palm up when LLA was within a few paces. Rhea carefully adjusted her weight while sniffing the air and maintaining a steady look, letting LLA see how hurt her paw was. "Oh," I let out a sigh she didn't know she. "Good girl," she whispered. "Let's take a look with a little flashlight." Investigated the paw, finding a sharp thorn embedded deep within the pad. Encircled by. She summoned the team back since it was swollen and a thorn. "I could take it out, but she might." Maddow tightened his hold on his tranquilizer rifle as Dr. Anderson raised it, prepared to act if necessary. "Be quick, radio." LLA took a pair of tweezers out her kit and moved. Rhea observed her closely. Her muscles were tense, but not aggressive. "It's all right. I'm almost finished practicing precision, and I'm calmed." Rhea flinched, but did not move the blood when Thorn drew it out in a single motion. Seeped from the incision, but it wasn't much. I immediately used antiseptic to clean the area and put a calming. Rhea whispered gently, "Save there," putting up her tools and lowering her paw too, gingerly testing it on the ground. She glanced at Lila before gently pushing her shoulder with her enormous head in a sign of. Back at the camp, the team reviewed gratitude that made Lila cry. Maddow, who was still disturbed by the day's events, said, "I didn't think she let you get that." Dr. Anderson smiled a bond, and it seemed as though she remembered everything. Between them is remarkable. It's uncommon to witness this degree of faith in a wild animal. Nodded her thoughts aside. Ryan knows that love is more than trust. Never injured her. When the team reviewed the video the following morning, they noticed Ryan moving more freely and that her limp was nearly gone. The realization made LLA feel proud and relieved that she had accomplished her goal of helping her tiger without sacrificing anything. Her wild spirit. But as the group rejoiced, a fresh obstacle was about to. Unease spread among the camp after reading reports of increased poaching in the nearby area. There seemed to be constant concern for Ray's safety because the camp was bustling with anxiety after reports of heightened poaching activity. The sanctuary is a refuge for. Although endangered animals had always been on guard, the threat seemed more immediate than ever as they sat in the monitoring station looking over the most recent reports, her fingers lingering over the keyboard while she gazed at the bright screen showing animal movement patterns in the sanctuary. Maddow stepped into his face grim. It has been established that a nearby reserve discovered traps close to their borders, which they believe are set by poachers. Focusing on larger animals, such as big cats, and clenching her fists, Rhea, and if someone spots her cubs, they're out there. Dr. Anderson broke his serene manner that downplays the seriousness of the situation. Therefore, we should double patrols and strengthen the perimeter, but we still need to think of the potential for them to enter the sanctuary. LLA shook her head and said, "No, I won't." When that occurred, the group immediately got to work, working with the local government and establishing cameras at extra surveillance locations throughout the sanctuary's perimeter were adapted to cover. Volunteers and blind spots joined the patrols with emergency supplies and radios. Kits, while Rhea the tiger and her cubs occupied Leia's attention, were located far from the main entry points, deep within the refuge. But that didn't make her worry any less because poachers were resourceful. When darkness fell, their avarice frequently overcame their fear of being discovered. As if holding its breath, the woodland Leia sat in the observation tower with two. Maddo joined her with a thermos and binoculars in her hands. Of coffee, you ought to rest, he added, setting the thermos next to her. Shook her head and said, I can't. Maddo gave her a comforting. Ree is a smart shell that senses danger, and we're doing everything we can to keep a hand on her shoulder. Hours went by before it got too close, and the bush was eerily silent. Every crack of twigs and rustle of leaves made my heart race. And just after midnight, a feint. When her console's alarm chimed, she quickly glanced at the screen of one of the perimeter cameras. Revealed movement as a dark figure darted through the trees. Matala's voice was sharp and snarled. We have movement at Sayer 3, so Maddo grabbed his radio and called the patrol squad when he saw someone close to the north boundary. Keep the patrol squad vigilant and equipped with torches and non-lethal deterrents. Move quickly in the direction of the site, and Maddo and LLA watched with apprehension as the team closed on the live feed. Leia's breath stopped in her throat when a loud boom, a gunshot, suddenly erupted as she closed in on the intruder. Throat no. The patrol team discovered that the noise was coming from a snare trap set up with a rudimentary alert system, which indicated that poachers had reached the area but wasn't yet a direct threat. Eventually, the trap was taken down, and the squad broadened their search area out of caution. We must locate Rhea before they face hazards back at the camp. So Layla paced the floor, her thoughts racing. Dr. Anderson nodded. If they've set traps, her cubs could wander into one. It's too dangerous to move at night. But what if you can trace her GPS signal at early light? Mateo softly cut off LLA's shaking voice, saying, She's a fighter, LLA, and you are watching out for her at daybreak. The crew left under Ray's guidance. Nearby, the noises of awakening wildlife filled the dark bush, but Lila's attention was only on the blinking. As they continued to explore the refuge, the dot on her portable GPS device, the terrain grew more difficult, with muddy trails, dense undergrowth, and dangerous slopes, and after several hours of hiking, they arrived at the location of Ree's signal. The group that was strongest stopped to look around for the tiger and her. The sight of new paw prints on the soft earth made Cub's Leia's heart race. The sound of rustling leaves caught their attention as she whispered close. When Layla looked around, she saw Rhea coming out of the brush, her enormous body standing out against the. For a brief time, everything appeared to stop when greenery the tiger's amber eyes met Lila's. Yet the relief was brief appearance behind Rhea of two of her cubs, whose jovial manner was cut short by a low growl from there. Mother Layla froze when a group of armed men appeared, following Ray's gaze. Dr. Anderson, the poachers are coming from the east, moving stealthily but clearly. We must quickly withdraw and beg for assistance, because we are unable to face them straight. But Lila's intuition told her that if they left Rhea, and she gripped the tranquilizer rifle slung over her more tightly, knowing that her cubs would be helpless. Maddo went forward, his voice stern. I'm not leaving her. We must be wise about this, as we cannot risk our lives to protect them. Maddo and Dr. Anderson circled as the poachers approached, and the crew divided to create a distraction, around to attract the men's attention. But LLA remained beside Rhea, prepared with her tranquilizer gun, as though sensing the threat, put herself between her cubs and the trespassers, and her roar became more intense. The poachers paused, their confidence wavering at the sight of the warning that reverberated through the jungle. Lila, a fierce tiger, capitalized on their hesitancy by firing a warning shot from. The dart from her tranquilizer rifle lodged itself in a tree trunk close to the men. Ree's intimidating presence and the team's combined efforts sent them reeling, compelled the poachers to leave their guns and traps behind. Returning to the camp, the team informed the authorities about the occurrence, guaranteeing that the security of the sanctuary would be strengthened. LLA sat next to Rhea and her. Cubs are so relieved that you're safe now, she whispered, caressing Rhea's fur, and we'll ensure that the relationship between Leia and Rhea remains that way, shown to be unbreakable. But the battle to save the sanctuary and its cherished inhabitants was far from over. Although the retreat was a brief triumph, Layla and the team were aware that the safety of the sanctuary was in jeopardy. Meetings were conducted every day for the next 3 days, and there was a sense of urgency and resolve in the camp. Plans to strengthen the sanctuary were implemented, and initiatives were displayed on whiteboards. Dr. Anderson stated, "We need to cover every entrance and weak point," pointing to the sanctuary's map that is affixed on the wall. No more near misses. Despite being worn out, LLA was unrelenting, and patrols are necessary to cover a larger radius. Be prepared if they attempt again. Maddow said that they also need community support. It will open our eyes if we can persuade residents to report questionable conduct. The crew put up a lot of effort, distributing leaflets and holding meetings in the surrounding villages and teaching the populace the value of preserving wildlife. Leia directly addressed residents, leaders highlighting the connection between their lively communities and the sanctuary's success. Habitat, but Rhea and her cubs remained near the center of the sanctuary. LLA spent hours watching them and recording their actions in the area with the strictest security. Rhea seemed, although she was blissfully ignorant of the increased activity, her behavior was more vigilant than normal with her cubs. As they chased one another and jumped on leaves, I felt a pang of. She confided in Mateo about her remorse, saying she shouldn't have to live this way. Mateo nodded. But because of you, she's always watching over her shoulder in the nighttime. The fact that she and her cubs are still alive is what counts. The tranquility didn't endure. A huge explosion broke the quiet as the crew got ready for their nightly patrols that evening, and Layla and Maddow fled. The northern perimeter is where their hearts are racing as they leave the monitoring station. One of the guards yelled, gesturing toward the thick jungle, and the crew quickly gathered their gear and hurried to the location. They discovered a piece of the sanctuary's fence had been blown apart when they got there. 2 guards were hurt close, but they were still conscious, and their faces were white with horror. Suddenly, one guard stumbled, detonated the device, and fled. Lila's blood began to boil because this was no longer a poaching issue. While securing the area and tending to the injured, the squad scanned them. Her heart fell when she saw footprints moving farther into the woods. They were pursuing Rhea. Maddow heard her whisper and took her arm, saying, "We need to regroup, we can't." Unprepared, she charges into Maddow with her cubs, and Layla's voice cracks. "I'll let them take her out of emotion." But Dr. Anderson stepped in with a stern voice. "Maddow, it's correct that we need a method to keep track of them, but we do this grudgingly." Lila nodded, her hands trembling perfectly. "But we use a combination without wasting any time." The team tracked the poachers' tracks through the jungle using GPS, monitoring, and footprints. It was gloomy and menacing, with suspense permeating every leaf, rustling, and crack. Following hours of tracking, the sight of a twig sent chills down their spines. Discovered discarded wrappers, a smoldering fire, and, most horrifying of all, the idea of Rhea and her cubs being imprisoned in a rudimentary cage big enough for a tiger made Layla's stomach turn. Maddow said, "What a terrible contraption they close." "Keep alert." The group's senses were heightened, and then there was a low growl, reverberated through the trees, causing LLA to freeze and search the shadow. She saw a glimpse of amber eyes ahead of her as Reyes the tiger stood guard in. Her body tensed and poised to attack in front of her cubs. The poachers appeared behind her. One of them, resolute and armed, raised a tranquilizer pistol and pointed it at Rhea no Leia, yelled as she came into view, shocking the poachers with her unexpected entrance. With their weapons drawn, Maddow and the other members of the crew engaged in a standoff, and the jungle fell silent. "Leave now, Lila," aside from the strained breathing of both people and animals. Despite the terror pulsing through her, she said in a firm voice, "You're trespassing on protected territory. You think a few rangers will stop us?" Land, the lead poacher, hissed. Maddow came nearer, his eyes cold, and there was money on that tiger. "You can either leave the prison cell with your name on it, or make sure you never leave this bush again," because the poachers were hesitant to. Rhea's confidence wavered, and then she roared loudly, demonstrating her strength. To demonstrate that she would not back down, the cubs gathered around her with their small. The roar served as the tipping point as they growled in imitation of their mother's defiance. One of the poachers mumbled as they started to flee after being overwhelmed and terrified. As the squad guarded the area, Layla said it was not worth it before vanishing into the darkness. The tiger's gaze softened as she cautiously approached Rhea, realizing her old. Ryan prodded her buddy Lila, who knelt and spoke in a shaky voice of relief that she was safe. The cubs appeared from behind, and Lila's hand with her enormous head was a sign of trust and appreciation. Their curiosity overcame their fear, and their mother couldn't help but smile. Back at the sanctuary, while the crew debriefed and praised their success, she was crying uncontrollably. Victory, the authorities were alerted, and the poachers were thoroughly investigated. In order to guarantee that the sanctuary would continue to be a secure place, security measures were doubled. Leia sat near Rhea's enclosure. "We accomplished it," she said, as she watched the tiger and her cubs slumber soundly. "Are safe." But Layla felt deep down that the sanctuary had won the battle. This conflict, but the fight to save wildlife went on, and she was prepared for anything. Came next, and the refuge was once more silent as its shadows whispered survival stories taught in bravery. But the recent attack had left the environment far from calm. Everyone was on edge, and the feeling that this wasn't the end persisted. She was reviewing surveillance footage late one evening when the radio buzzed. "You must watch this." When Mateo's voice became urgent, she reached for a flashlight and hurried to the observation deck, where Dr. Anderson and Matto stood with their faces on display. Pale on the screen, a party of poachers with heavy weapons could be seen going through the jungle in silence. "This time they brought troops," Matto stated grimly, and Lila's heart beat. The team promptly organized, contacting the authorities and collaborating with local legislation since they needed to act immediately. Enforcement, but they were aware that assistance would not reach them in time, so they fought. "The sanctuary's Rhea and her cubs are depending on us, so hold them off," LLA said. Guards positioned themselves to survey the deep jungle with night vision goggles, noise deterrent, and tranquilizer weapons. Were dispersed, and Layla guided a small group to the enclosure that Ray was determined to safeguard. The tigers at all costs. The air became more intense. The jungle was teeming with sounds, including bug hum, leaf rustle, and distant nocturnal animal calls. But behind it all was an undertone of peril, followed by a burst of movement. He readied his weapon as the first poacher emerged, his figure silhouetted against the starry trees. But the night the sanctuary security system went off, a loud alarm sounded, engulfing the area in a terrible "Hold your positions, floodlights," yelled the. Some poachers fired aimlessly into the air, scattering their cover in the process, to turn off the alarms, while others continued on unabated, causing havoc at Rhea's enclosure. The tigress paced nervously since her cubs had been awakened by the ruckus. Layla squatted beside the fence and cried gently, her voice comforting. "It's okay, girl." One of the poachers who had abruptly appeared out of the shadows. He aimed his tranquilizer rifle at Rhea, avoiding the major fortifications, with the explicit goal of stopping Leia. Yelled as she moved into his field of vision, causing the poacher to pause in astonishment. Audacity, but a deep growl sounded behind him before he could respond, so he turned his. Rhea had overcome the tiger's secondary barrier, and her eyes were wide with terror. With a thunderous roar, she charged, her golden eyes burning with fury, standing tall and defiant. Rhea didn't see the poacher drop his weapon and run away into the jungle. Give chase instead. She went back to her cubs and reassuringly nuzzled them while LLA looked on in wonder. Heart bursting with pride, the tigress was battling for her family, not just for herself. In the meantime, when the poachers were overpowered by the alarms, the sanctuary's defenses held firm. Coordinated resistance and lights started to flee, but LLA knew they couldn't. "Allow them to escape without any difficulties, and follow me," she said, guiding a small group inside. The hunt was fierce, and the poachers, desperate to avoid being caught, fled the bush. A path of devastation behind them, including crushed vegetation, abandoned machinery, and hurriedly weaponry. But Lila and her gang persisted until they eventually surrounded the group close to the. When the poachers realized they were outnumbered, they raised their hands in the sanctuary's northern perimeter. Fortunately, the police showed up a short while later and took the offenders into arrest. They were worn out but victorious. When she returned to the sanctuary, the team applauded and they could feel the relief. "You did it," Mato exclaimed, full of praise. Nala, she said, looking at Rhea. We did it as dawn broke. The tigers were secure and sound as the refuge was surrounded by golden light. Ella stood by the enclosure with her hand pressed against the warmth of their ordeal behind them. You are amazing against the glass, she said. Never let anyone take away your freedom. Rhea looked her in the eyes, and they were filled with strength and tranquility. It was a moment of recognizing a connection that went beyond species. The sanctuary became into a beacon of news of the poacher's capture spread with optimism and tenacity, highlighting the predicament of endangered. Donations for wildlife flooded in, and the sanctuary grew, assisting additional creatures in finding refuge. Although the battle was far from ended, she realized it had been worthwhile when she saw Rhea and her cubs flourish. The tigers had taught her a valuable lesson. Always defend what you love, no matter the circumstances. The sanctuary had withstood it. The poachers were stronger and more unified than ever as the largest storm emerged. Due to the evidence acquired during the raid, their illicit network was uncovered and dissolved, and they are currently behind bars. A triumph not only for the refuge, but also for the innumerable creatures whose lives this would save. Action as the sun rose over the treetops, and Lla strolled across the sanctuary grounds. She experienced a profound sensation of, although the battle had been difficult, it had brought out the best in all people, and creatures alike. In the days that followed, Rhea and her cubs flourished. Rhea stayed vigilant despite the cubs' more daring antics, which delighted everyone who witnessed them. Her grace and strength filled everyone in awe, and the sanctuary became a representation of tenacity that draws tourists, volunteers, and supporters from all around the world. Schools organize field excursions that allow kids to get a close-up look at the magnificent creatures and discover the significance of conservation. Lla assumed a new position as a teacher, telling the tale of the refuge. As Ray would say along her amazing journey, she is more than just a survivor. As the sanctuary one evening, she serves as a reminder that all lives are important and that we are all connected. When the employees gathered for a celebration, Mateo toasted Lee for never giving up, and to Rhea, who gave us a true understanding of courage, who grinned and flushed her cheeks. She emphasized that this was a collaborative effort and that Rhea should take the most of the credit. The group's laughter reverberated throughout the night as they clinked their glasses, asking why we do what we do. The sanctuary's success also served as a demonstration of the strength of group effort. In response to more significant developments, regional governments bolstered their anti-poaching legislation, and conservation groups worked together to make endangered species habitats safer, and Rhea's tale became a rallying cry for animal conservation that motivates people everywhere to act to save Lla life. At the sanctuary became her greatest happiness, and each day presented both fresh challenges and opportunities. Chances to change things. She frequently went to Ray's cage and sat silently while the tigress kept watch over her cubs, and they shared an unspoken understanding that was formed over. One day, while sitting by the enclosure, she saw Rhea standing at the intersection of their shared suffering and triumph. The tigress approached her, her golden eyes staring at her every step. Slowly and deliberately, she stopped a few steps away from her enormous form and lowered her head, holding her breath, and her heart grew so full of emotion that it seemed as though, as Rhea expressed gratitude, Lila's eyes welled up with tears, and she muttered, "You're welcome, girl. You're welcome." The sanctuary kept expanding, turning into a haven for Hope Ray's cubs, as well as wildlife. Eventually, they grew up, and on the day of their release, they were ready to move into the wild and continue their mother's legacy. Rhea remained behind her decision to stand at the forest's edge and watch as the young tigers vanished into the trees, continue to serve as evidence of her connection to the refuge and to Lla years later. When Lla thought back on her voyage, she became aware of how much Rhea had taught her. The tigers had taught her about love, resiliency, and the Roar's message of the value of standing up for what you believe in resonated in her heart as a reminder that every attempt, no matter how tiny, it might have an impact, which is why the sanctuary tale. Rhee's legacy endured throughout the lives she led, continuing to serve as a tribute to the strength of compassion and courage. Would you ever struggle to save something you love if it were touched by both humans and animals? Tell us in the comments section below, regardless of the odds. And if Rhee's tale motivated you, don't. Remember to like, subscribe, and share so that together we can change things.